Chris Moore, welcome to Bendiksen Airways.
Good morning or evening or day.
Yeah, evening. How's life in Santa Fe?
It's lovely. We actually have a hope of rain today, which for us is very important. Um, but yes, our summer interns are here, so we have the pitter patter of little undergraduates, and yeah, we just got through a long workshop about AI with industry people, community advocates, unions, computer scientists, lawyers, legal scholars, and so on. That was very interesting.
Nice. I'm excited for this talk. I've been trying to get in contact with someone who can explain to me what chaos theory is.
Aha.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can you tell me
Well,
something about that?
so, uh, I mean, expect you and your listeners have heard about butterflies and hurricanes and all of that. So what the technical term is sensitive dependence on initial conditions, so that small initial conditions of a system, small changes to its initial state will, as its dynamics unfolds, lead to increasingly large differences in its new state, its current state, so that beyond a certain horizon, it's very difficult to predict it at all. And that is one of the major sources of unpredictability in the world. It is not the only source of unpredictability in the world. There is also the fact that many systems do some kind of computation. And so predicting their eventual behavior is going to take as much computational effort as whatever computation it is that they are doing. And in fact, my PhD thesis long, long ago was on simple dynamical systems with even just with two or three dimensions, which can simulate Turing machines. They can simulate universal computers. So you may be aware of Turing's halting problem and the fact that there's no computer program, there's no fixed method, no algorithm which can tell whether other computer programs or algorithms will ever complete their work. And so for these systems, predicting whether the state will ever fall into a particular area or whether it will ever loop back and start over again becomes just as hard as Turing's halting problem, and therefore is undecidable, uncomputable, which so no matter how much precision you have to measure the system, and no matter how much computational power you have. So that's kind of fun. And Turing's halting problem, the proof of it is the proof that it cannot be solved is a kind of lovely paradoxical proof, which is that if computer programs could really predict the behavior of other computer programs, you could ask them to predict themselves and then add a little twist so that they halt if they don't halt and don't halt if they do. Contradiction. Therefore, there's no such beast. There's no such program. And this brings us to another kind of unpredictability, which includes people and the social world. If you try to predict the future, but I'm aware of your predictions, well, I might choose to do something else, or I might use your predictions in some strategic way and change my choices. And so, when we talk about economics, when we talk about human behavior, then we really can get it's not a contradiction. It's the fact that we can change our own choices based on what we believe about human nature or what we believe about the consequences of our actions.
Very interesting. Before we move on, how would you introduce yourself?
I'm Chris Moore. My title is professor here at the Santa Fe Institute. We we don't grant degrees. We're not a college or university, but if I were just called a researcher, that would not sound as fancy.
So you're an
So
institute, is that correct?
yes, I'm at the Santa Fe Institute, which
What's
is
the
a
difference? between an institute and a university?
Well, we don't have regular classes.
Okay.
And we don't give out bachelor's degrees or doctorates or master's degrees. We have a very popular summer school in complex systems, and we have postdocs who are here as research collaborators. But Yeah, we really are all about research, and we're a very interesting place because we don't have departments. So, I mean, I'm originally trained as a physicist. I got very excited about computer science kind of right around when I was getting my PhD. Now I'm interested in all sorts of things, and we encourage that here. So we don't have disciplinary boundaries the way you do at a standard university. And this encourages a lot of very interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, anti-disciplinary thinking.
Yeah.
We have a t-shirt that says undisciplined science, in fact. So,
Yeah. Nice. So, what makes a system complex rather than complicated?
very good. Let me start with an example. Some people are really enjoying playing these games involving decks of cards where each card has different characteristics and gives you different powers and cancels out some other cards and amplifies some other cards. And I don't really like these games, but I guess the joy of playing them is kind of keeping all of this in your head and gaining a sense of what different strategies might be and how to build different kinds of strength and blah blah blah. On the other hand, the game of Go, the 5,000-year-old game of Go, has extremely simple rules, but very, very deep strategies. And in fact, although it's true that AlphaGo, the AI system, is now the world champion, actually, a lot has happened since AlphaGo beat the human world champion. It's still a game that a lot of people play, and somehow those very, very simple rules give rise to very deep and subtle strategies. So I would say that when you go from uh, relatively simple interactions to amazing, complicated global behavior, that is one of the calling cards, one of the signs of complexity and complex systems. To me, also, complexity is a lens through which we look at the world. I don't think of systems necessarily. I mean, yes, some of them are definitely more simple or more complex than others. Some of them may be merely complicated as opposed to complex. But I also think of complexity as a an intellectual attitude that we bring to the systems we look at, which is why I use the phrase of a lens, which is not original with me, by the way. But I would say that, for instance, the physics lens, the traditional physics lens, is when you look at a system and you look for simplicity, you look for solvability, even if that's of a solvable special case, even if you have to neglect certain things to render it solvable, such as when in Newtonian mechanics we ignore the resistance on the cannonball. And by ignoring the resistance on the cannonball, we lose a little bit of fidelity, a little bit of realism. But what we gain in return for that is a beautiful understanding of gravity and the parabola it will follow, or the ellipse that it will follow if we put it into orbit. That, I would say, is the physics lens, looking for symmetry, looking for simplicity. Then there's the mathematical lens of looking for rigorous proofs. There's even the lens of biology and evolution, where you say, well, maybe the reason why this thing in the world is the way it is that it has evolved to be this way. It was under some selective pressures. It was competing with or cooperating with other entities that were also trying to evolve. That's the way it is. That in turn is similar to the optimization lens. This thing is the way it is because, in some sense, it is the best possible. In some sense, it maximizes some objective function or some utility function, or it minimizes some error. I even have a lot of respect for what you might call the narrative lens that people in the humanities engage in, where they say, well, I'm not not really looking to lump this thing, this moment in history, or this poem, or this novel. I'm not really trying to find a general theorem of poems or novels. I'm trying to dive into the details of this thing and really appreciate it. This is a little bit like 19th century natural historians, where they would say, this symbiosis between this mushroom and this fig and this wasp and this tree is amazing.
Mm.
And so, if you like, that is the lens of diving into details and appreciating those details, as opposed to soaring above and looking for general universal rules. So, I would say the complexity lens is when you're looking at a system, you come to it with a pretty open mind about what's going to be important about the entities in it, the interactions between them, but you're looking for opportunities to see how those interactions build a surprising whole out of their parts. And this means you could be studying atoms in a material with complicated mechanical or electronic properties. It means that you could be studying societies and markets. You could be studying bacteria in the microbiome, helping you digest your food through a very complicated network uh, of cooperation and competition. So it's a lens through which many of the systems which have evaded traditional scientific thinking can be looked at. And so I think that's what makes it so exciting.
You said earlier that it's difficult. It's difficult to, what should I say, get all the parts of different systems to be able to predict. But let's say if you had unlimited computational ability, would you be able to predict anything that's going to happen?
Well, yes and no. I mean, of course, there's quantum mechanics. There's also the issue that if the system is chaotic, if your initial measurement of it is a little bit off, then pretty soon your predictions will be very far off, even if you have a lot of computation. So to get this discussion off the ground, let's say you have infinite computational ability and perfect precision to observe everything microscopically. And let's suppose that we're talking about Newtonian mechanics instead of quantum mechanics. So this is what we call Laplace's demon. If you could see all of the molecules, all of the elementary particles in my body and my brain, and if you're going to try to predict me 5 minutes from now, I guess you also need to know everything within 5 light minutes of me, which could come in here and affect me or affect my behavior. Could you predict me? Yes, in some sense, but it's a pretty useless sense, right? I mean, the gap in complexity between understanding the elementary particle physics and understanding psychology or cognition is so vast that even if some demon or god could do this, it wouldn't help us understand anything, right? One of our founding figures in Santa Fe and the complex systems world is the physicist Philip Anderson, um, who wrote a wonderful paper called More is Different. And his point was that when you get a lot of things together, genuinely different things happen that you could not predict from their individual interactions. And, I think I would say the traditional reductionist view is that cognition is caused by neuroscience, and neuroscience is caused by molecular biology, and molecular biology is caused by chemistry, and chemistry is caused by elementary particle physics. And so, if you're a good old-fashioned reductionist, you'd say, well, I'm just going to study particle physics because that's the most important thing. It causes all of these other things.
Mm.
But of course, even if tomorrow we woke up and we found the grand theory of particle physics, the grand unified theory that included relativity and quantum mechanics and everything else, we still wouldn't understand the brain. We still wouldn't understand cognition. We still wouldn't understand people and societies. And so these different levels of reality really deserve different kinds of reasoning. They deserve different kinds of scientific inquiry. Um, I think one of the things that I enjoy about being here is I get to learn how different fields, different branches of science, what they think is a good question. What do they think a good question is like? And what do they think counts as a good answer to that question? And different sciences, and for that matter, humanities, and for that matter, policymakers or engineers, or have very different pictures of this. And that's interesting. You gain a sense at a deep level how different intellectual cultures approach problems and look for solutions.
Yeah, I guess I'm asking because I'm bringing it all the way to potential free will or not.
I choose to believe I have free will. Ha ha ha. Yeah, for me, the explanatory gap between the physics and my brain and my friends' brains is so vast that I think there is plenty of room in there to find free will if you want to find it. I think there's plenty of room in there to find, morality and empathy and lots of other human values as well that I think are partly tied to free will because when we think about ethics, we think that, well, you're making choices and you're morally responsible for those choices. And where does that go if we don't have free will? I don't think it has anything to do with quantum mechanics. I know some people do. I really don't think it has anything to do with quantum gravity. I know some people think that. I think it has to do with the fact that it is so hard for us to understand even ourselves and each other that one of the best ways to think about people is by embracing the idea that they have beliefs, that they have desires, and that they make choices. Um, Here's a not very good analogy, right? I mean, I'm sitting here in this room full of air, and these air molecules are, roughly speaking, little ping pong balls bouncing around. But because they're so small and I'm so much bigger and there's so many of them, all I sense about them is their temperature and their pressure, their overall statistical behavior. And if this room had more of a wind in it, I would also feel the flow of air, and that could mean I would also be sensing their turbulence. And turbulence is very chaotic and very complicated, but I would still not be feeling the individual molecules. So if I were going to think about air or water, I would probably use these variables. I would use this description of it, not in terms of individual molecules. So this may seem like a bit of a stretch, but I would say that if you're going to think about people, then thinking about their beliefs and their desires and their values and their choices is similarly the right framework to think about them. Um, and of course, even then, people disagree. An economist might say, no, no, all we need to know is your utility function. And then, we'll be able to predict what you do. And okay, maybe I'm skeptical. Uh, but your particles, I don't think we need to know. I don't think it would
Mm.
help us to know them, and I don't think we need to know them to talk with you and to, you know, figure out with you how to be a good person in the world or, um, yeah, what we should do about this societal problem or that societal problem.
Exactly. You spoke about all the air molecules and that you can't see each and every one. I guess this takes us to emergence. What is emergence and how does it happen in practice?
Well, I would define emergence as that process by which very surprising global behavior emerges from these often quite simple interactions between individual things. And, I would say that, for instance, the fact that uh, turbulent whirls and eddies and swirls in a flowing river are emerging from the interactions of the individual water molecules. I would say that our ability as humans to develop language and to coordinate on amazing projects, build amazing things, also make large amazing mistakes. I would say that's some kind of emergent property of us as some primates who are more social than other of our close relatives and who evolved on the savannah only a few 100,000 years ago. Um, I know that, I mean, emergence is not a new idea. I think it's been around for a long time.
Mm,
I think that the economist Hayek would say that prices are an emergent signal that we use to communicate information to each other in a market, uh, et cetera, et cetera. So I would say it's when that global level, uh, that that global level appears and has some reality of its own and might in some challenging sense be caused by the individual entities and their interactions, but how you get there is tricky. As someone who does a lot of computer science, I might even say that the fact that this laptop we're on can compute is an emergent property of, on the one hand, the way electrons and semiconductors work, and also the way that a ton of transistors on a chip can work. I might even say that the way that an algorithm solves a complicated problem is an emergent property of the many, many individual, very simple arithmetic or logical operations it's doing. Literally turning this bit on if one of those two bits is on. You
mm,
know, that that individual operation, calculating the and the or and the not of zeros and ones and producing new zeros and ones is somehow sufficient to carry out any computational task. And that's amazing, right? And another aspect of emergence actually is that sometimes it leaves the microscopic world behind. For instance, what do I mean by that? I think that if we have another planet with very different chemistry than ours, that isn't based on carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen, but something else, methane or ammonia. I have a friend here, Chris Kempis, who studies this sort of thing. Well, my guess is there would still be something like evolution and natural selection happening on that planet. You might even imagine some similar forms depending on, gravity and blah blah blah, the atmosphere and so on. You might even imagine some similar strategies emerging from parallel evolution. In the same way, so that's a case where let's see, where emergence can give rise to universality, where by universality I mean that you often see the same high-level phenomena in
mm,
systems whose underlying workings are very different from each other. This is what happened to computation in 1936. Before 1936, computation was sort of a, oh, we know it when we see it kind of thing. People going back to the logician David Hilbert and even to centuries before that, the Islamic mathematician Al-Khwarizmi, who we named the word algorithm after. That's where the word algorithm comes from. They were interested in, well, which mathematical problems do we have a method to solve, a kind of recipe, or Hilbert called it an effective procedure. There was some compound word in German for that. But it seemed to be there was no real agreement as to what counts as an effective procedure. It was it looked like in some sense it'd be something that you could carry out with pencil and paper, maybe with formal symbols, perhaps. It means not making leaps of intuition and which are good things, but different things. Um, then along in 1936, what happens is Turing says, well, if you're going to do it with pencil and paper and a finite alphabet of different symbols, it might as well be a roll of tape, and they might as well be just zeros and ones. And instead of having an infinite memory yourself, you might as well just be something that can look at the things on this tape, maybe scroll forward and backwards a little bit, and read them, and then erase them and write them and change them. And that is enough to do any computational process. At the same time, Alonzo Church came up with a different idea called the lambda calculus, which survives in some programming languages today. It looks totally different, but it's actually exactly equivalent. And at the same time, Kurt Gödel came up with his proof of undecidability, that certain results cannot be proved, which turns out to be very similar to the uncomputability uh, of Turing's halting problem.
Just a question on Gödel's incompleteness theorem. Does that mean that we will never actually be able to detect reality?
I, well, no, I don't think so. I mean, Gödel's theorem is about the mathematical world, not the real world. And the way I think at the time, many people viewed it as a kind of defeat that, oh, there are mathematical truths that we'll never be able to prove. That's very sad, right? I think that's wonderful, right? It means that mathematics is infinite. We're going to keep having to be creative and to come up with new ideas, new proof techniques, um, even new axioms to extend mathematics. It will never be done. With the real world, I guess, I mean, there's no such thing as a theorem about the world, right? There are only theorems about mathematical models of the world, formal pictures of the world. And uh, so I think there will always be a gap between us and the world and our ability to perceive it. There will always be something missing in our perceptions. Um, I guess having been raised in physics, which has gone through a long history of making our making our theories a little bit less wrong each time, right? Uh, Starting with Aristotle's intuitive physics and moving to Newton's laws, and then adding electromagnetism, and then adding relativity, and then adding quantum mechanics. Each of these theories does not completely destroy the theory before it. In fact, often it restates or generalizes or extends the theory before it. And I do like to believe we're getting closer to reality at each step, at least to the reality, the parts of reality that physics is good at describing, which might not be the biological and social parts. Uh, will we ever get there and be done with it? I don't know. Maybe not. Uh, the journey is the thing.
Yeah. Do you think that consciousness itself is an emergent phenomenon?
I think that is a very reasonable thing to believe. Let's start by saying that cognition, our ability to think and plan and you know, uh, take large tasks and break them into smaller tasks and talk with each other about how we should do them, um, and to reason about uncertainty, to know when you should keep hacking away at one approach to a problem and when you should give up and try something completely different. This is, the exploit versus explore trade-off. Some people call that metacognition. I certainly think all of that is very emergent. Um, Consciousness for me is a little hard to understand. I'm not a neuroscientist, nor am I a cognitive scientist, nor am I really a philosopher. Of course, we're all kind of armchair philosophers. We're all sort of amateur cognitive scientists. Uh, David Chalmers, who I'm sure you've discussed before in your show, talks about the easy problem and the hard problem. Have you already? Yeah. So the so-called easy problem is all of neuroscience and all of the brain, figuring out how the brain does what it does anatomically, computationally, neuroscientifically. Um, the hard problem is why is there someone in here
Mm.
experiencing this? And could there be, as we call it, a philosophical zombie, which is doing the cognition, but somehow the lights aren't on. There's no one in there. Um, and you know, I really am not sure what I think about this. I mean, my cat cannot do symbolic computation. Even if you give my cat a beach or a sandbox to draw in, I think even if you gave my cat opposable thumbs, my cat would not be able to carry out a logical calculation. Of course, there are a lot of things my cat does that I cannot do. Um, but I certainly think my cat is conscious of the world around him and he perceives things, he enjoys them, he's frightened of them, he chases them. Um, so he is certainly perceiving the world and reacting to it. And come on, I think anyone who has ever met an animal knows that they have an inner life, right? Uh, so then, we get to chatbots and LLMs, and, you know, there was a small group discussion at the workshop I was at this past week about are the lights on? And I did not go to that small group discussion because I thought it would be just another freshman dormitory level, you know, philosophy conversation. Um, just because I skipped that discussion doesn't mean I think I know what's going on. I certainly do not think that current AIs are conscious, but I don't think there's any fundamental reason why that couldn't change in the future as they gain more of an ability to do introspection, to reflect on their own thinking, the way we do, and so on. So yes, but there's something miraculous. I mean, I'm a funny person philosophically, in that I am a materialist. I think that we are material objects. I don't think there's anything supernatural about me. I think it turns out that even material objects can fantastically and wonderfully live and think and be conscious. That's an amazing fact. We don't need a supernatural explanation. Not that we're anywhere near a real material explanation either.
Exactly. Well, I asked you about uh, Gödel's incompleteness theorem and the reality. But of course, there are some physicists that believe that information is fundamental, or mathematics is fundamental. I spoke to Vlatko Vedral, a quantum physicist, a
Yes.
couple of days ago, who has some theories there. So that's why I asked. But what role do you see information play in physics and complexity theory?
So information and computation, I would say, are another one of the lenses that we can look at things through, right? So, for instance, what is a cell doing in your body? I mean, it's doing chemistry and it's doing a lot of thermodynamics, right? So it's making ATP to run, to power the reactions that are happening in the cell. It's constructing proteins that physically break things apart and put them together. But it is also clearly doing a lot which would best be described in terms of information. I mean, all of this, or a lot of this energetic chemistry is there for the purpose of taking your genome and reading it and transforming that into sequences of amino acids and then copying that genome and also doing a lot of error correction, right? So modern cells are doing a lot of error correction to try to fix mutations and prevent cancer and just prevent everything from falling apart. Copying, error correction, these are things that are the lifeblood of information theory. If you go back to Claude Shannon, another one of the great mid 20th century founders of this field. Um, when you study the mathematics of thermodynamics, what we call statistical physics, so the physics of materials composed of many atoms, whether those are crystals, which are some of the easiest to understand, or whether they're liquids, which are harder, or glassy systems, which are quite challenging to understand, and for which Giorgio Parisi, who I also view as one of the founders of our field, won the Nobel Prize in Physics, along with two other guys a few years ago. So in statistical physics, when you look at the mathematics, if you then go across the hall and talk to a friend of yours who's doing machine learning or statistics or data science or AI, they will say, hey, that's exactly what we're doing. You have this probability distribution, things like to be in low energy states, but because they're not at absolute zero temperature, they spend a lot of time in high energy states too, but they're kind of trying to minimize their energy. Well, if you flip that over, you get Bayesian inference, where the most likely state is the one that has the highest probability, the highest likelihood, or anyway, don't want to get too technical, but of generating the data that you observed. But because there's noise, which is like heat in physics, because there's always noise in our observations of data, there's always some uncertainty, then it's hard for us to find the most likely explanation. There might be some probability distribution of what explanation we settle on, just as in a liquid or a gas or a solid, it spends some time in higher energy, less likely states. It's literally the same mathematics. So a lot of, uh, you know, in physics, we talk about entropy. Entropy is information. Actually, there are things people should know, right? Entropy is not necessarily meaningful information. White noise has a great deal of entropy. Uh, and ironically, the digits of pi do not have very much entropy in a sense. If you realize they're the digits of pi, then you can just spit them out deterministically. If you don't know that, then they look pretty random. So information and meaning are not the same. Entropy is more about uncertainty or surprise, unpredictability. But in any case, yes, information has been in physics since the mid 1800s. It was kind of hidden there for a while. And I think it was hidden until Shannon and von Neumann realized that Shannon's communication theory was really talking about the same entropy that Ludwig Boltzmann's thermodynamics was talking about, which is fascinating, right? Entropy was invented to study steam engines, right? Thermodynamics was invented to make better steam engines.
Hmm.
Well, the reason why steam engines are not perfectly efficient is that they're leaking information into the world around them. When you have heat loss and you just sort of warm up the world around you, then that nice, steady mechanical energy that you were using to run your motor or drive your locomotive is getting lost in all the tiny, hard to observe random vibrations, random thermal motion of the world around it. That is a loss of information. That is an increase in entropy, as we talk about. So now I think what's interesting, I said before that information is not the same thing as meaning. Once you get into systems which can do computation, then you're doing something which I would argue is even more interesting because now you're taking information such as the input to a problem, a question, and you're transforming it, you're unfolding it, and somehow trying to turn it into the answer to that question, the solution to that problem. And that's something which Shannon didn't study, and uh, that's something which is very much a post-Turing and increasingly 21st century idea.
If we move on to networks and collective behavior, why do networks appear everywhere in nature and society as well?
Well, we spoke before about how a lot of emergent behavior comes from the simple interactions between small or simple things. Um, which, by the way, I shouldn't always say that they're simple. I mean, it could be interactions between people. Um, even individual neurons, my biologist friends tell me, are not so simple. They're cells, they're very complicated. They have their own needs, and especially when the brain is first developing, they search, they explore, they migrate, they move around. They're much more complicated than transistors. But anyway, uh, so if you're going to talk about the interactions between things, networks are a very useful picture of this. If you will, yet another lens, if you want to add this to your box of lenses.
And how
And
do you define a network?
so I would say in general, a network is what we turn to when we think that part of what's important about a system is the structure, the patterns of interactions between things. So if we want to say this entity, this node in the network is very influential, well, there are several reasons it could be influential. One is it could have edges or links to a very large number of other nodes. Another possibility is that it has just a few links, but that it stands kind of in the middle of things, so that every interaction between this part of the world and that part of the world has to pass through it, right? So it can act as a kind of choke point and therefore an important mediator or communicator between two important parts of the world. Um, I saw a wonderful talk by a historian here, John Paget, who was using network theory to study Renaissance history. And Cosimo de' Medici was a very central member of the network. If you draw links for the marriages, the military alliances, the money lending alliances, the financial alliances, he's right at the center. And everything had to go through him, which gave him enormous power, enormous leverage. If you want to study the spread of a disease in society, well, traditionally, we did this by using a kind of very simple, what we call mean field approximation, where we just said, well, everybody's kind of in one big pot, and all you need to know about a population is how many of them are infected and how many of them are susceptible and how many of them have recovered or died. Well, of course, that's not enough. We saw this in COVID, right? Particular people in particular professions, and particular neighborhoods, and even particular demographic groups were much more vulnerable to COVID than others, at least in this country, and I think in others too. And that was because, if you will, of their place in the social network. If you are a bus driver and you're constantly interacting with many people, well, obviously that's going to make you more vulnerable. A former student, Alexander Mercier, and a friend, Sam Scarpino, and I have a paper where we looked at, we were not modeling COVID specifically, but we were looking at trying to understand what are the important links in a network which can cause a disease to spread. And a link can be important in multiple ways. If you have going back to the bus driver example, right? If you have a subway that millions of people are on every day, obviously that is a link that will spread a lot of disease. But if you have a business class commuter flight from New York to Los Angeles, even if there are only 10 people on it per day, it could still be uh, a very important link structurally to spreading the zombie apocalypse from New York to Los Angeles, or vice versa. So, all of these are kind of network theory insights. They're about looking at how things are connected with each other, um, and what is the structure that, including the topology of those connections. So I think that as we've started to gain more and more data, so, I mean, from online social networks um, to genetic regulatory networks and so on, it's become a very important tool. I will say that, like the other lenses we've talked about, like the other attitudes about what's important we've talked about, I think that the network theory approach is good at seeing some things and bad at seeing others. I think it's very good at seeing things that are kind of very bottom up, right? Its picture of the world is that there are lots of entities. Yes, maybe some are stronger or bigger or have more connections than others, but they're all fundamentally the same kind of thing.
Mm.
And they have these connections between them, and that's where emergent behavior comes from. So it's very peer-to-peer in its attitude about the world. I would argue that it's not a coincidence that network theory rose in the 1990s when the Soviet Union was falling apart and the internet was getting going. And it really felt as if the world was becoming more decentralized.
Mm.
I think now we're seeing in a lot of places, including my country, the resurgence, the re-emergence of centralized power, where important influences are coming from the top as opposed to emerging from below through the peer-to-peer interactions of people. And I think that, for instance, people who want to study populism or how does an authoritarian use the fears or beliefs of a population in order to take over, well, that's an interesting combination of decentralized and centralized power, right?
Yeah.
So I think this is something that a purely network point of view is not necessarily able to embrace. I think that, yes, people talk to their friends and convince each other of things, but we also receive a lot of our opinions from centralized media, from centralized platforms. I think also we have an interesting technological moment where a lot of platforms, right? What is a platform? It's something which is originally marketed and perhaps originally intended as a decentralizer, a democratizer to connect people and to spread power out. And yet someone owns that platform. And at some point, someone wants to make money off that platform and maybe wants to sell ads and wants to surveil the people on the platform so it knows what ads to sell them. And maybe wants to sell lots of other information about them too, to a variety of entities.
Yeah.
So platforms are confusing things because they're simultaneously centralizing and decentralizing. This is something which I want to think about in the next few years as part of my next act as a researcher.
Is that also, well, if we think about social systems becoming too interconnected and therefore fragile?
Yeah, people talk about that a lot. I mean, it's true that, and I think you see, so like my friend Raisa D'Souza studies this interconnections between different infrastructure networks. We had a power failure in New York a few years ago where uh, it was winter. Texas lost their electric power because they didn't insulate their natural gas turbines or something. The solar and wind worked fine, by the way. It was the fossil fuel plants that went down. Then, because New Mexico has these high mountain plateaus, people here could not get natural gas to heat their homes, not because we had a shortage of natural gas, but because we didn't have electricity to run the pumps to pump the natural gas uphill. So that's a very interesting connection between the electricity, the power grid, and a different infrastructure network, in our case, the network of pipes that carry natural gas. And, uh, we're seeing a lot of this sort of interaction between different kinds of networks. It's true that as a network becomes more highly connected, and this is what everyone is saying about epidemics now and global pandemics with international air travel and so on. Yes, at one level, in some ways, we are more vulnerable. Things can spread more quickly. It's harder to island off, as we say, some part of the network. On the other hand, having a lot of redundant connections can also make systems more robust by giving them more. For instance, if you have a highly connected power grid, it might help you route around a power line which has failed, and you might not even know that a power line went down, except in some small area, because the overall network remained strong. So I think it's complicated. I think it depends on what kind of thing we're talking about. In social systems, you know, you hear both things from people. You hear, on the one hand, oh, our global connections are helping us understand each other and experience lots of different cultures and blah, blah, blah. You also hear people saying, oh, our global network is destroying all these small cultures and getting rid of all of the rare languages and replacing everything with homogeneous media and homogeneous culture. You hear both things, and I think it's quite complicated. I think it's complicated whether AI will increase and preserve diversity or destroy it. I mean, I would love to have an AI tutor. I speak a little bit of Danish. I told you this before we started
Mhm.
because my mother's parents and grandparents were Danish. Um, and but I've spoken the same tiny fragment of Danish for 30 years. I would love to have a tutor that, it would be even better if it was a human, but humans are expensive, and so I would love to have an AI tutor that would improve my Danish, and not to mention my French, which is also terrible. Um, and on the one hand, so I was talking with somebody from one of the native tribes here. We have these pueblos in New Mexico, and they're trying to keep their languages alive.
Mm.
And on the one hand, having AI learn the language and act as a tutor would be wonderful. On the other hand, right now, the way they're doing this is having their kids hang out with the elders of the community, listening to them and talking with them. And you don't want the AI to replace hanging out with the elders because hanging out with the elders is also important in its own right, but it does feel like it could be part of the solution. So anyway, sorry about that tangent, but
No.
I think that increasing connections can make systems both more fragile and more robust. Um, and when you look at things like the brain, you see a lot of long-range connections between parts of the brain. Um, but you do also see local structures which are doing somewhat specialized tasks than neuroscientists tell us. So there's some combination there of global connection, but also of modularity, and which I think we can assume evolution has somehow found, if not the optimal, then a pretty good mix of those two. So probably we need a mix of those two, local and global.
So a bit further on AI then, do you think that AI could become impossible for us to predict or fully understand?
Well, it's already hard for us to fully understand it. I mean, going back to emergence, even if I give you all of the individual weights of a deep neural network, I tell you, which ones are connected to which other ones and how strongly. In an artificial neural network, as everyone says, it's still very challenging to understand its inner workings. And in some sense, that means that its behavior, its accuracy, or its success is an emergent property, which is why we have people inside in industry and in academia working hard to make things more interpretable or explainable. Um, you know, And so I think it's already quite a challenge. Uh, that said, I also kind of agree with some people like Henry Farrell and Cosmo Shalizi and Alison Gopnik, who say that at least what current AI is doing is in some cases it's in some sense remixing human knowledge, right? It's trained on human produced text and so on. And it is in some sense not just recalling, I'm not saying it's merely looking stuff up, but recalling but and recombining human knowledge in order to do new things. There was a great example just this past week where, for the first time, I think it's fair to say, an AI solved an open mathematical problem, which a fair number of people cared about. And, it found a proof that I think any of us would have been proud to have found on our own. Now, then you dive in, and there's a very interesting set of commentary by different mathematicians about this achievement. And what they said is, okay, well, let's look at what it actually did. It knew, because it's read almost everything, it knew that over here in this small subcommunity of mathematics is a technique which might solve the problem that this other community of mathematicians had been struggling with. And these two communities just hadn't talked to each other very much. I mean, the intellectual world is large, and there's no way, like, the joke goes that ever since like 1920 was the last time that anyone could claim that they know all of physics, that they know all of mathematics.
Yeah.
So maybe even before that. Um, so the AI put these two things together and got a result. So you can, depending on your mood, right, you can say, oh, okay, it's just recombining. Well, that's true. On the other hand, as an interdisciplinary researcher, a lot of the results that I'm proudest of have been of exactly this flavor, where I was a kind of broad-minded, curious intellectual, and I had read this stuff over here, and I imported it. I acted as an import-export agent and brought it over here, and everybody thought I was really smart, and that was great. Well, so a lot of good science happens that way through that kind of recombination. And if AI can help us with that, that would be great. Um, AI is also extremely good at pattern matching,
Mm.
at recognizing analogies. I have been impressed recently. It used to be that when you search on keywords, and I've had this happen to me, where because this other scientific community or mathematical community, they were thinking about the same thing, but using completely different terminology, different vocabulary. And so when I search on keywords, I don't learn about any of their work, and I do something that actually they already know. Um, I think somehow AI is pretty good at knowing about that. Uh, it's almost you can search about the idea and it will recognize to some extent that a similar idea has been looked at over there. So that's pattern matching, not literally matching words, but matching the structure of the thing you're talking about. Um, and so a lot of human thinking and a lot of human creativity consists of remixing, right? Think about, sequencers and rap and it consists of pattern matching. I think the challenge for me, if I want to be team human, is what else is there, right? Um, is there something else there?
Mm.
Or is it just that some people are better at those things than others? Um, and once AI is better than all of us, there'll be nothing left to do. I don't know. I do think that human thinking is amazingly flexible. Um, you know, we cannot actually do that much with our own brains, at least I can't with mine. If you ask me to think about geometry, I'll pull out a pad and paper or a blackboard. Notice the old school blackboard. Or if I'm Archimedes, I'll draw in the sand with a stick. I will use something outside my brain to augment my brain.
Mm,
That's why we have spoken language. It's why we have written language. It's why we have libraries. And AI is at the very least something which expands that at the next step. And, we can argue about whether it's more than that, but it is at least that. And if I'm thinking about a new math problem that nobody's thought about, I might invent a new language for it. I might invent new objects, new symbols, in order to capture its structure. So we're very good at that. We're very good at on the fly inventing new, what some people call them cognitive technologies or cultural technologies that extend our abilities as thinkers. And when you look at current AI, where it often fails is the fact that it is so much based on text. So I know this is changing. People are making it multimodal. They're giving it, I mean, if you can give it scratch pads, you could give it a whiteboard to sort of a virtual whiteboard to draw on and then look at. A whiteboard which will automatically kind of preserve the idea that this is a circle and that that's a straight line and it meets the circle in two places and blah blah blah, right? And since it's virtual, it could be a 17-dimensional whiteboard, which I cannot handle. So that would be great. But so far, it's very based on text. So um, I'm proud to say, and we should probably bring this to a conclusion at some point, so you should cut off my crazy tangents. But I am proud to say that there are 10, no, sorry, there are 8 Sudoku puzzles of my design. There's this wonderful community of puzzle designers out there. Are part of a data set at Sakana.ai, where Sakana gives these Sudoku problems. They're not the old-fashioned ones. They have all sorts of loony new rules, like along this path, it's a palindrome, so if you switch the order of the digits, it would be the same. Or I'm going to tell you the total of the things in this box, but I'm not going to show you any of the numbers. Stuff like that. So far, the most advanced models, last time I've looked at Sakana's webpage, have solved about 30% of these puzzles. And humans have solved all of them. And of
mm.
course, as designers, we are trying to create aha moments, enjoyable, exciting moments of insight where you say, oh, I see what's going on. And then the rest of the solution flows pretty easily. So that's what puzzle design is about. Um, and so I think that's also what these deep questions about what is thinking, what is creativity, and is that what AI is doing? If it's not, will it do it sometime soon? Is it something else, and so on? So,
All right. Let me ask a couple of last questions here.
sure.
Uh, what is something about reality that becomes stranger the more deeply you look at it
Uh,
or study it?
well, I mean, of course, historically in physics, it's gotten pretty strange, right? I mean, you know, we've had these repeated revelations uh, that electrons are not little balls, that they are kind of waves, that they're sort of in many places at once. That there's this thing that called the wave function, which is sort of happening everywhere all at once, and it's this incredibly high dimensional vector, and it's just rotating around. That's all it ever does, and yet that generates all of the physics we see. We have this strange business that when you measure things, they suddenly are not quantum anymore, at least from your point of view. And is that because you're changing them by measuring them, or is it just that you and they are now entangled, and now you're still both quantum things, but you're on track with them being in a certain way. You're locked into that part of the wave function. This is all very weird, right? Um, and you know, some people are still trying to interpret quantum mechanics, which is a little different from understanding it. It's certainly different from using it. So the funny thing is that in physics, you have some people saying, we don't understand quantum mechanics. It's just this mathematics that you can use to get answers, but we don't understand it. And other physicists to say, we understand it just fine. It's this mathematics you can use to get answers, right? But I think everyone would agree that it is very hard to map onto our day-to-day experience of the world where coffee cups are in one place. And, so it's a challenge. Um, for me, so I have a kind of side project. So I got interested in AI. I'm interested in politics. I was actually on the Santa Fe City Council, the city council of my town for 8 years. Um, and there are certain things about our politics and our society that I'm very worried about. And one of the things I'm worried about is people using AI to make important decisions without really understanding it and without understanding that, yes, it knows some things, but there are other things it doesn't know and it's capable of making mistakes. And I'm especially worried about this in areas where people's rights are really important that affect their lives, like should the government put you in jail or not? So, you know, um, when I look at the legal, so this has made me read like Supreme Court rulings and law articles, and I'm friends now with a number of lawyers and court administrators and public defenders who think about these things here locally. And the more I hear them talk about it, the more fractally weird it gets because the depth of human behavior is infinite. The crazy things that people do to each other, but also the crazy things that judges do to them in courtrooms. You know, you know, and and the law is very interesting. It is sort of like logic, but not really. It is something which is by design full of gray areas, full of fractally complicated boundaries, where we're constantly saying, well, this should be an exception, but that should be an exception to the exception. And, who has the burden of proof to prove that it goes this way or that way? And this, for me, is fascinating and is definitely like not just a rabbit hole, but an infinite branching rabbit anthill. And so people in society definitely weirder the closer you look.
All right, final question. What's the meaning of life?
Oh, for Christ's sake. All right. Okay. Well, luckily, I have an answer to this question, which is back in the 1970s, there was a television adaptation of Roy Bradbury's The Martian Chronicles. And in this adaptation, Rock Hudson is the Earth astronaut. And he's walking around in some 100,000-year-old ruins on Mars by one of the canals, right? Which is all dried up now because the civilization is long gone, and he meets a ghost. And the ghost is a Martian dressed in a kind of Roman toga. And he says, "Oh, I've met a ghost." And the Martian says, "No, you're the ghost." I'm going to do a bad English accent. And he says, "What do you mean? The canal is dry." "No, what do you mean? Do you not see the women, the lights? Do you not hear the music? My friends are waiting for me." And Rock Hudson says, "Well, I wanted to meet you to find out. You're such an ancient, wise civilization. What is life about?" And the Martian says, "Life, life is its own answer. Life is to be lived. It's to be enjoyed." I think that's a, I think that's a pretty good answer. It's certainly, I have nothing to add to that as a physicist. I am very, in all the chaos and fright of society right now, there's a lot of things I'm pessimistic about in society. Human beings still make beautiful art. We still care for each other. We still find new ways to cure diseases. We still dream of going to Mars. We still discover the secrets of the universe. We still dance. We still play music. I We still raise children and teach them about how wonderful the world is. Uh, I don't know. I All of the shit we're in, I just want us to keep our heads above it and keep striving for all of those wonderful things.
Yes, thanks for answering my questions.
Thank you. Have a great evening.
Thank you very much. Tusen takk for at du hørte på Bendiksen Airways. Dersom du har tips, kommentarer eller vil gi en vurdering av episoden, så gjør gjerne det. Det setter jeg stor pris på.